The house was far too quiet, as if it held its breath in anticipation of something, the kind of silence that crept into every corner, amplifying the smallest creak of the floorboards or the faint whistle of the wind against the windows. Lila sighed, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup, the drink inside untouched and lukewarm. Jeremy had left early that morning for yet another business trip, his hurried goodbye a brush of lips against her cheek and a promise to call, words that had begun to lose their meaning over the years. She glanced out the window, watching the backyard stretch out before her, an expanse of meticulously trimmed grass bordered by flower beds that her father-in-law Henry maintained with almost obsessive precision. It was one of his many habits, his way of ensuring order in a world that often felt unpredictable. Lila appreciated the beauty of his efforts, but rarely ventured outside to enjoy it. The yard, like the house, felt like it belonged to him more than her. Henry was a quiet man, the type who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders without ever letting it show. When she first married Jeremy, she had been intimidated by his father's reserved nature, mistaking his silence for disapproval. But over time, she had come to understand that Henry simply observed more than he spoke, his sharp eyes missing nothing. That realization had made her uneasy in a different way, as if he could see straight through her, past the polite smiles and surface-level pleasantries to the restlessness she tried so hard to suppress. Today was no different. Somewhere down the hall, she could hear him moving about, the faint clink of tools and the low hum of his voice as he worked on one of his endless projects. She found his presence both comforting and unsettling, a steady anchor in the house, yet a constant reminder of the unspoken distance between them. The hours stretched ahead of her, unbroken by plans or purpose. The emptiness of the day gnawed at her, urging her to find something, anything, to fill the time. She decided to tackle the guest room closet, a neglected space Jeremy had promised to organize months ago. It was a task she had been avoiding, the kind of chore that seemed to grow more daunting the longer it was put off. But today, with nothing but silence and her own thoughts for company, it felt like the perfect distraction. The guest room was bathed in warm afternoon light, the sun streaming through the curtains and casting golden patterns on the hardwood floor. Lila rolled up her sleeves and set to work, pulling box after box from the cramped closet. Dust swirled in the air, tickling her nose as she opened one lid after another, uncovering forgotten linens, mismatched shoes, and clothes that hadn't seen the light of day in years. The day started quietly, but Lila could feel the tension brewing beneath the surface, thick and suffocating, like the air before a storm. Jeremy had gone out for a morning errand, leaving her and Henry alone in the house. They avoided each other, each finding refuge in separate corners, but the silence was oppressive, their shared guilt pressing down like a leaden weight. By the time Jeremy returned, the house felt like a powder keg ready to explode. He walked in with a grocery bag in one hand, his movements brisk and purposeful. Lila watched him from the kitchen doorway, her heart pounding as she tried to gauge his mood. "Where's Dad?" Jeremy asked, setting the bag on the counter. "In the garden," Lila replied, her voice trembling despite her efforts to sound calm. Jeremy nodded, his expression unreadable as he grabbed a bottle of water and headed toward the back door. Lila stood frozen, her chest tightening as she imagined what might happen next. She wanted to stop him, to say something that might diffuse the tension, but the words wouldn't come. Through the window, she saw Jeremy approach Henry, who was kneeling by the flower beds. The two men exchanged words, their postures stiff and guarded. Lila couldn't hear what they were saying, but she didn't need to. The rising volume of their voices told her everything. She stepped outside, her hands trembling as she approached. "What's going on?" she called, her voice shaking. Jeremy turned to her, his face a mask of anger and confusion. "You tell me," he said, his tone sharp. "Dad was just telling me how much you've helped around here while I've been gone, almost like you've taken over my place." Lila's breath caught in her throat, her mind scrambling for a response. I was just helping out," she stammered. "That's all." Jeremy's gaze hardened. "That's all? Then why does it feel like something's going on between you two?" Henry stood, his expression calm, but his posture tense. "Jeremy, you're overreacting. Lila's been nothing but supportive while you've been away. You should be grateful." "Grateful?" Jeremy's voice rose, his frustration boiling over. "Grateful that my wife and my father are keeping secrets from me? Do you think I'm stupid?" "Jeremy, stop," Lila said, her voice cracking. "You're jumping to conclusions." "Am I?" he snapped, his eyes narrowing as he turned to her. "Because the way you're both acting says otherwise." The silence that followed was deafening. Lila felt the weight of Jeremy's accusations pressing down on her, her heart racing as she struggled to find the words to defend herself. But no matter what she said, she knew the truth was written all over her face. Henry stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "That's enough, Jeremy. You're letting your imagination get the better of you." Jeremy laughed bitterly, his hands clenched into fists. "You think I don't see it? The way you look at each other, the way you avoid me every time I try to talk to you. Something's going on, and I'm not leaving until I get the truth." Lila's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. She wanted to deny it, to tell Jeremy he was wrong. But the words caught in her throat. The weight of her guilt was too heavy, suffocating her as the truth threatened to spill out. "It's not what you think," Henry said, his tone calm but resolute. Jeremy turned to him, his anger boiling over. "Then what is it, Dad? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've crossed a line." The air crackled with tension, the unspoken truth hanging between them like a loaded gun. Lila felt her knees weaken, her body trembling as the world seemed to tilt beneath her. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice breaking as she turned and fled into the house. Lila locked herself in the bedroom, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. She sank onto the bed, burying her face in her hands as sobs racked her body. She could hear the muffled sound of their voices outside, the argument growing louder and more heated. Minutes felt like hours as she sat there, her mind a whirlwind of regret and despair. She had known this moment would come, had felt it looming ever since the first kiss she and Henry had shared. But no amount of preparation could have steeled her for the reality of it. The sound of the front door slamming snapped her out of her thoughts. She stood, her legs shaky as she moved to the window and peered outside. Jeremy's car was gone, the driveway empty save for Henry's truck. The quiet that followed was almost worse than the shouting. A soft knock on the bedroom door startled her, and she turned to see it slowly open. Henry stood there, his face drawn and weary. "He's gone," he said quietly. Lila sank back onto the bed, her hands trembling as she stared at him. "What did you tell him?" "The truth," Henry replied, his voice heavy, "or at least part of it. I told him we'd grown close while he was away, that you'd been there for me when I needed someone." "And did he believe you?" she asked, her voice hollow. Henry shook his head, his expression pained. I don't think so, but I didn't give him more than that. Lila buried her face in her hands, the weight of their situation crushing her. What are we going to do, Henry? He'll come back, and when he does, he'll want answers. Henry crossed the room, sitting beside her. We'll deal with it, he said, his voice steady. Together. She looked at him, her heart aching with a mix of love and despair. I don't know if I can do this anymore. He reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. You can. We can. Lila closed her eyes, leaning into him as tears streamed down her face. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, all she could do was hold on to the one thing that still felt real, her connection to Henry. Halfway through the pile, the warmth of the room began to feel stifling. She paused, unbuttoning her blouse and slipping it off, leaving her in a lace-trimmed camisole that offered some relief from the heat. She reached for a lighter shirt from the bed, distracted by the soft rustle of fabric and the hum of her own thoughts. The sound of the door creaking open behind her made her freeze. Lila? Henry's voice cut through the air, low and composed as always, yet tinged with an edge she couldn't quite place. She spun around, clutching the shirt to her chest. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Henry stood in the doorway, his hand still on the doorknob, his expression unreadable. His eyes flickered briefly to the bare skin of her shoulders before darting away. But the fleeting glance was enough to send a flush of heat creeping up her neck. Oh, he said, clearing his throat and averting his gaze. I didn't realize you were. I should have knocked. It's okay, she managed, her voice tighter than she intended. I should have locked the door. He lingered for a second too long, as if unsure whether to step forward or retreat. Then, with a nod, he stepped back and pulled the door closed behind him, the soft click echoing in the room like a punctuation mark. Lila stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. She told herself it was just the surprise of the moment, the awkwardness of being caught off guard. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. It wasn't just the embarrassment of being seen in such a state. It was the way he had looked at her, even for that brief moment. Or maybe it was her own reaction to that look, the faint, undeniable thrill that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Shaking off the thought, she quickly pulled on the shirt and returned to her task, though her focus had shattered. Every time she reached for another box, her mind replayed the scene, dissecting every detail. The way his voice had faltered, the flicker of something in his eyes, the weight of the silence that had hung between them. By the time she finished, the light outside had shifted, casting long shadows across the room. She carried the last box to the corner and dusted off her hands, her movements brisk and purposeful, as if trying to shake off the lingering tension. But as she stepped into the hallway, she hesitated. Henry's door was slightly ajar, the sound of a radio drifting out. A soft murmur of music mixed with the occasional scrape of wood against metal. She considered going in, saying something to diffuse the awkwardness that still clung to her like a second skin. But what could she possibly say? Sorry you walked in on me half-dressed felt too flippant, and anything else felt like acknowledging something she wasn't ready to face. Instead, she walked past, her steps quick and quiet, the knot in her stomach tightening with every step. The kitchen offered a momentary reprieve. She busied herself with making tea, the familiar motions grounding her as she poured the water and watched the steam rise. But even here, her thoughts betrayed her, pulling her back to the look on Henry's face, the way his hand had gripped the doorknob as if he were holding himself back. She took her tea to the living room, settling into the corner of the couch and pulling a blanket over her lap. The warmth of the tea soothed her, but her mind refused to quiet. She told herself it was nothing, a fleeting moment of awkwardness that would fade with time. But the memory lingered, vivid and sharp, carving itself into her consciousness like a scar. The sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled her from her thoughts. Henry appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the room even before he spoke. "Dinner will be ready in about an hour," he said, his tone as steady as ever, though his eyes didn't quite meet hers. "Okay," she replied, forcing a smile. "Do you need help with anything?" "No, I've got it under control." He hesitated, his hand resting on the back of a chair. For a moment, it seemed as though he wanted to say more, but then he nodded and turned away, leaving her alone once again. Leela exhaled, her shoulders sagging as the tension drained from her body. She sank deeper into the couch, her thoughts swirling like the steam rising from her tea. Something had shifted between them, something subtle yet undeniable. She wasn't sure what it was, but she knew it couldn't be ignored, not forever. As the evening settled over the house, the silence returned, heavier than before, and in the quiet, Lila found herself wondering what lay beneath the surface of Henry's calm exterior, and whether she wanted to find out. The next morning, the house felt different, though Lila couldn't quite put her finger on why. The air carried a weight to it, as if something unspoken had settled between her and Henry after yesterday's incident. She tried to shake the feeling as she poured herself a cup of coffee, but her thoughts betrayed her, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. The steady rhythm of Henry's footsteps announced his approach before she saw him. He walked into the kitchen, freshly showered, his hair still damp, his flannel shirt rolled up to his elbows. He moved with the same quiet efficiency she had come to associate with him, but his usual morning greeting was absent. Instead, he nodded to her, his expression unreadable, before reaching for the coffee pot. "Morning," she said, her voice deliberately light as she took a sip from her mug. "Morning," he replied, his tone neutral. For a moment, silence filled the kitchen, broken only by the sound of his coffee being poured. Lila busied herself with her phone, scrolling aimlessly through social media, but she was acutely aware of his presence. She could feel his eyes on her, though every time she glanced up, he seemed focused on something else. "I'm heading out to the garden," he said finally, breaking the tension. "There's some trimming I need to finish before the weather turns." "Do you need any help?" The words escaped her before she could think them through. He paused, his hand on the coffee pot. "If you'd like." The answer was non-committal, but it was enough to make her heart skip a beat. She nodded, setting her mug down and following him outside. The crisp morning air was a welcome relief from the house's stifling atmosphere. The garden was as immaculate as ever, every flower bed meticulously arranged, every hedge perfectly trimmed. Henry handed her a pair of gloves and some clippers without a word, then gestured toward a row of shrubs that needed attention. They worked side by side in silence, the only sounds the occasional snip of the clippers and the distant chirping of birds. Lila stole glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking, noting the way the sunlight caught the strands of gray in his hair, the way his hands moved with practiced ease. She had always admired his dedication to the garden, but today her admiration felt tinged with something else, something she didn't dare name. "Jeremy used to help me out here when he was younger," Henry said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. Lila glanced at him, surprised. He rarely talked about the past. Really? I can't picture him as the gardening type. Henry chuckled, a low rumbling sound that made her chest tighten. He wasn't. He complained about it every time, but I made him do it anyway, said it would teach him discipline. Did it work? She asked, unable to keep the amusement from her voice. He smiled, faintly, a shadow of regret flickering across his face. Not exactly. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Lila hesitated, unsure whether to press further, but her curiosity got the better of her. Do you ever talk to him about that kind of stuff now? Henry paused, lowering his clippers and leaning against the handle of a rake. Not as much as I'd like. He's busy, always running from one thing to the next. That's just who he is. There was no bitterness in his tone, only a quiet resignation that tugged at her heart. I guess that's why he's away so often, she said softly. Henry nodded, his gaze fixed on a distant point in the garden. He takes after his mother in that way. She was always looking for something just out of reach. I suppose I shouldn't have expected him to be any different. The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard. It was rare for him to open up, and she found herself drawn to the raw honesty of his words. Before she could stop herself, she reached out and placed a hand on his arm, the touch light but deliberate. I'm sure he appreciates everything you've done for him, she said, meeting his gaze. His eyes softened, and for a moment, the distance between them seemed to dissolve. He placed his hand over hers, his touch warm and grounding. I hope so, he said quietly. They lingered like that for a beat too long, the moment charged with an energy neither of them could ignore. Then, as if realizing the intimacy of the gesture, Lila pulled her hand away, her cheeks flushing. I should get back to these shrubs, she said, her voice shaky. Henry nodded, his expression unreadable once more. Right. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Lila threw herself into the task at hand, avoiding any further conversation, but the weight of their earlier exchange lingered. By the time they finished, her hands were sore, and her thoughts were a tangled mess. Inside, she found herself restless. The house felt too quiet again, the silence pressing down on her. She wandered into the living room, her eyes landing on the fireplace. It hadn't been used in weeks, but the thought of its warmth was oddly comforting. She gathered the supplies and set about building a fire, the crackle of the flames filling the room with a soothing rhythm. As she sat back on the couch, staring into the flickering light, she heard footsteps behind her. You got the fire going, Henry said, his voice softer than usual. Lila glanced over her shoulder to see him standing in the doorway, his hands in his pockets. It felt like the kind of day for it, she said, with a small smile. He hesitated before stepping into the room, taking a seat in the armchair across from her. The light from the fire cast shadows across his face, highlighting the lines that years of hard work had etched into his features. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt different now, no longer heavy but charged with something unspoken. Lila's gaze flickered to his hands, rough and calloused, resting on the arms of the chair. She wondered if he felt it too, the shift in the air, the pull that seemed to draw them closer, despite everything. Thank you for helping in the garden today, he said finally, his voice breaking the spell. Of course, she replied, her tone light. It was nice to get outside for a bit. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the fire. It's good to have company out there. It's been a while since I've had that." The words struck a chord in her, stirring a mix of guilt and longing that she couldn't quite explain. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she leaned back against the couch, letting the warmth of the fire wash over her. The tension between them remained, unspoken but undeniable, as they sat together in the glow of the flames. The storm arrived suddenly, sweeping across the sky like a dark curtain. Heavy clouds rolled in, blotting out the sun, and the wind howled through the trees, bending their branches under its force. Lila stood by the living room window, her arms wrapped around herself as she watched the first fat drops of rain splatter against the glass. "It's coming down fast," Henry said from behind her. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, his flannel shirt unbuttoned at the collar and his hair tousled from the wind. He looked calm, as he always did, but there was an energy about him that matched the storm outside. "Do you think it'll last long?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. "Hard to say," he replied, stepping into the room. "Storms like this tend to linger." The lights flickered overhead, and Lila felt her chest tighten. She had never liked storms, especially when Jeremy was away. There was something about the combination of chaos outside and the solitude inside that unsettled her. "Looks like we're in for a long evening," Henry said, his gaze shifting to the fireplace. "We might lose power. Best to get another fire going." Lila nodded, grateful for the distraction. She followed him into the living room, where the remnants of yesterday's fire still lingered in the hearth. As Henry gathered kindling and wood, she knelt on the rug, arranging the ashes and stacking the logs carefully. Their hands brushed as he passed her a piece of wood, and she felt a jolt of awareness that she quickly tried to ignore. The fire roared to life quickly, its warmth spreading through the room as the wind howled louder outside. The lights flickered again, and then, with a soft pop, they went out completely. "Figures," Henry muttered, his tone calm despite the sudden darkness. Lila reached for her phone, switching on the flashlight and casting a beam of light across the room. "Do we have candles?" "In the kitchen," he said. "I'll grab them." She watched as he disappeared down the hallway, the glow of her phone barely illuminating the space. The storm rattled the windows, the sound filling the house like a living thing. By the time Henry returned with a handful of candles and matches, her nerves were on edge. "Here," he said, setting them down on the coffee table. He lit each one with practiced ease, the soft glow casting flickering shadows across the walls. "Thanks," she murmured, sinking onto the couch as the tension in her chest eased slightly. Henry sat in the armchair across from her, his features bathed in the warm light of the fire and candles. The storm raged on outside, but the room felt cocooned, insulated from the chaos. For a while, neither of them spoke. The crackle of the fire and the rhythmic pounding of rain against the windows filled the silence, creating a strange sense of intimacy. Lila's eyes flickered to Henry, noting the way the firelight softened the hard angles of his face. He looked younger like this, less burdened by the weight he seemed to carry daily. "You don't like storms, do you?" he asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. She hesitated before answering, unsure how he had noticed. "Not really. They've always made me uneasy." "Why's that?" She shrugged, tracing a pattern on the fabric of the couch. "I guess it's the noise, the unpredictability of it all. It makes me feel out of control." Henry nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I suppose that makes sense. There's something unnerving about nature reminding us how small we are." Lila glanced at him, surprised by the insight in his words. "You don't seem bothered by it." He smiled faintly. I've lived through enough storms to know they pass eventually. No use fighting what you can't control. His words struck a chord in her, and she found herself wanting to know more. Is that how you approach everything in life? Not everything, he admitted, his tone quieter now. But there's wisdom in picking your battles. The room fell silent again, but the air between them felt different now, less charged, more open. Lila leaned back against the couch, letting her guard down for the first time in what felt like weeks. You've done a good job with the house, she said, her voice softer. It always feels so well cared for. Henry looked at her, his expression unreadable. I try. It's important to keep things in order, especially when life has a way of getting messy. The unspoken weight of his words hung in the air, and Lila felt her chest tighten again. She wanted to ask what he meant, to push past the walls he kept so carefully constructed. But before she could, the storm surged, the wind slamming against the windows with a force that made her jump. Henry noticed her reaction and leaned forward, his voice steady. It's just the wind. The house can take it. I know, she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to steady it. He stood, crossing the room in a few quick strides. Here, he said, reaching for the blanket draped over the back of the couch. He unfolded it and draped it over her shoulders, his hands lingering for a moment as he adjusted it. Thanks, she murmured, her cheeks warming. He stepped back, his gaze lingering on her for a beat longer than necessary. The firelight danced in his eyes, and Lila felt something shift between them. Something she couldn't name, but couldn't ignore. I'll check the windows, he said finally, breaking the spell. She watched as he moved through the room, his silhouette outlined by the glow of the fire. The tension in her chest didn't ease this time. If anything, it grew stronger, coiling tighter with every passing second. Later that evening, as the storm began to ease, they found themselves drawn back to the fire. Henry returned to his armchair with a fresh cup of coffee, while Lila sat cross-legged on the rug, staring into the flames. I don't think I've ever seen a storm this strong, she said, breaking the silence. They're rare, he replied, his tone calm, but they leave the air feeling cleaner once they're gone. Lila nodded, her gaze still fixed on the fire. I suppose that's true. It's just hard to see the good in it when you're in the middle of the chaos. Henry didn't respond immediately, but when he did, his voice was softer. That's the trick, isn't it? Seeing past the chaos. She glanced at him, her eyes meeting his in the flickering light. You make it sound so simple. It's not, he admitted, but sometimes it's the only way to keep moving forward. The honesty in his words caught her off guard, and she felt a surge of emotion she couldn't quite place. Before she could stop herself, she reached out, her hand brushing against his. Henry, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, his gaze steady but searching. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, the air between them thick with unspoken feelings. Then, as if realizing the weight of the moment, he pulled his hand back, his expression unreadable. We should get some rest, he said, his tone firm but not unkind. Lila nodded, her heart pounding as she stood and gathered the blanket around her shoulders. She glanced at him one last time before retreating to her room, the storm outside mirrored by the turmoil inside her. As she lay in bed that night, the sound of the rain fading into a soft patter, Lila couldn't shake the memory of Henry's gaze. It lingered in her mind, vivid and consuming, until sleep finally claimed her. The storm may have passed, but the tension between them remained, unspoken yet undeniable. And as the days stretched on, Lila found herself drawn closer to Henry, the boundaries between them blurring with each passing moment. The storm had left behind a world that felt strangely new. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden hue over the backyard. The grass shimmered with dew, and the air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth. Lila stood at the kitchen sink, staring out at the garden as she washed the breakfast dishes. Henry was already outside, tending to the damage left by the storm. She could see him kneeling near one of the flower beds, his hands working steadily to prop up the battered plants. She had barely slept the night before. Every time she closed her eyes, the memory of Henry's gaze lingered, vivid and consuming. She had felt it, a connection she couldn't name but couldn't deny. It terrified her, but it thrilled her too, igniting something inside her that she hadn't felt in years. As if sensing her thoughts, Henry glanced toward the kitchen window. Their eyes met, and Lila quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing. She dried her hands on a towel and took a deep breath, willing herself to shake off the feelings that had taken root in her chest. "I need to get out of this house," she muttered under her breath. But even as she said it, she knew she wouldn't go far. The pull toward Henry was too strong, and no matter how much she tried to resist, some part of her didn't want to. By mid-morning, she found herself in the garden, her hands gloved and her hair tied back as she worked beside him. They had fallen into an easy rhythm, their movements synchronized as they repaired the damage together. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the occasional sound of birdsong or the rustling of leaves in the breeze. "You didn't have to help," Henry said after a while, his voice low and steady. "I wanted to," Lila replied, not looking up from the hedge she was trimming. "Besides, it's the least I can do after all the work you put into this place." He smiled faintly, his hand stilling as he straightened and wiped the sweat from his brow. "It's not just work. It's therapy." Lila glanced at him, surprised by the honesty in his tone. "Therapy?" He shrugged, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "It keeps my mind busy, gives me something to focus on when everything else feels complicated." The weight of his words settled between them, and Lila felt a pang of guilt. She wondered if she was part of the complicated he was referring to. "It's beautiful, you know," she said, her voice softer now. "The garden, it's a reflection of you." Henry turned to her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence charged with unspoken meaning. Then, as if deciding something, he reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. Lila's breath caught in her throat. The gesture was innocent enough, but the way his fingers lingered, the way his eyes held hers, it was anything but. They were interrupted by the sound of a distant car engine, breaking the spell between them. Henry stepped back, his hand dropping to his side as he glanced toward the driveway. "Someone's here," he said, his tone suddenly brisk. Lila nodded, her heart still racing as she turned to follow him inside. Later that afternoon, the visitor, a neighbor, dropping off supplies, was gone, leaving the house quiet once more. Lila tried to focus on her chores, but her mind kept drifting back to the moment in the garden. She replayed it over and over, dissecting every detail, every nuance, until she wasn't sure what was real and what was imagined. By the time the sun began to set, she couldn't take it anymore. She needed to clear her head. Grabbing a book from the shelf, she headed out to the patio, hoping the fresh air would help. She had barely settled into the chair when Henry appeared, a glass of iced tea in his hand. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his tone casual. "Of course not," Lila replied, her heart skipping a beat as he sat down beside her. For a while they sat in companionable silence, the soft chirping of crickets filling the air. Lila tried to lose herself in her book, but she was acutely aware of Henry's presence beside her, the way his arm rested on the armrest, the way his shirt clung to his chest in the fading heat of the day. "What are you reading?" he asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. She held up the cover, showing him the title. "Just something light." He nodded, leaning back in his chair. "I can't remember the last time I had the patience to read for fun." "You should try it," she said, smiling. "It's a good escape." "Maybe I will," he replied, his gaze lingering on her. The air between them grew heavy again, the unspoken tension wrapping around them like a shroud. Lila's pulse quickened as Henry leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Lila," he began, his voice low and deliberate. She looked at him, her breath hitching at the intensity in his gaze. "Yes?" "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he said, his words measured, "but I feel like something's changed between us." Lila's throat tightened. She wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, and pretend she didn't know what he was talking about. But she couldn't. The truth was too obvious, too heavy to ignore. "It has," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I thought it was just me, but the way you've been looking at me, I can't ignore it." Lila's cheeks flushed and she looked down at her hands. "I don't know what's happening, Henry. I just know I can't stop thinking about—" She broke off, unable to finish the sentence. Henry leaned closer, his voice soft but firm. "About us?" Her eyes snapped to his, wide with shock. He had said it. The thing she hadn't dared to name. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice trembling. "But it scares me." "It scares me too," he admitted. "But it's there, Lila. We both know it." The silence between them was deafening. Lila's mind raced, torn between the desire to flee and the pull to stay. Before she could decide, Henry reached out, his hand brushing hers. The touch was electric, sending a jolt through her body that left her breathless. She looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Henry," she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't respond. Instead, he leaned closer, his eyes searching hers for permission. Lila's breath caught, and before she could think, before she could stop herself, she closed the distance between them. Their lips met, soft and tentative at first, but the spark between them quickly ignited into something more. Henry's hand cupped her face, his touch gentle but firm as he deepened the kiss. Lila's mind screamed at her to stop, to pull away before it went too far, but her body betrayed her, leaning into him, her hands gripping the fabric of his shirt as if she were afraid to let go. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, their faces flushed. "I shouldn't have done that," Lila said, her voice trembling with a mix of guilt and exhilaration. "Neither should I," Henry replied, his gaze steady, "but I don't regret it." Lila's heart ached at his words, torn between the warmth they brought and the weight of their implications. "I don't know what this means, she said, her voice barely audible. Neither do I, he admitted, but we can't ignore it anymore. They sat in silence, the weight of their actions hanging heavy between them. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in shadows as the first stars began to appear. As Lila stared into the darkness, she knew one thing for certain. There was no going back. The days following that kiss blurred together, each one a tangled knot of anticipation, guilt, and stolen moments. Lila woke every morning with a sense of dread and excitement that warred within her. She replayed their kiss in her mind, dissecting every touch and glance, every unspoken word that passed between them. It haunted her, a constant reminder that something in her life had irrevocably shifted. Henry, too, seemed changed, though he carried on with his usual routines, tending the garden, repairing things around the house. There was a subtle difference in his demeanor. His glances lingered longer. His voice softened when he spoke to her, and his presence in a room seemed to fill every corner, making it impossible for her to think of anything else. They didn't speak about what had happened, but it hung between them like an unspoken pact, binding them together even as it pulled them deeper into something neither could name. It was a quiet evening when the tension between them finally cracked. Lila was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner. The soft hum of the radio filled the room, its cheerful tunes a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her. She heard Henry's footsteps before she saw him, the sound familiar now, a rhythm she had grown to anticipate. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice steady but low. She glanced at him over her shoulder, her hands stilling on the cutting board. "I've got it, but if you want to keep me company, I wouldn't mind." Henry nodded, stepping into the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms as he watched her work. Lila felt the weight of his gaze, her pulse quickening despite her efforts to stay composed. "Do you remember the first time you cooked in this kitchen?" he asked suddenly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. She chuckled, grateful for the lightness of the question. "How could I forget? I burned the garlic, dropped a pan, and almost set off the smoke alarm." "You were nervous?" he said, his tone teasing. "Trying to impress Jeremy." "Probably," she admitted, though the memory felt distant now, like a story she had read, rather than lived. "I guess I wanted to prove I belonged here." Henry's expression softened. "You've always belonged here, Lila." The words caught her off guard, striking a chord deep within her. She looked at him, her heart aching with an intensity she couldn't ignore. "I don't know about that," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I do," he said, his gaze steady. "You've done more for this house, for this family, than you realize." The silence that followed was thick with emotion, the unspoken weight of everything they couldn't say. Lila turned back to the cutting board, her hands trembling as she resumed chopping the vegetables. Henry stepped closer, his presence warm and steady behind her. "Lila," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She froze, her breath hitching as he placed a hand on her arm, his touch light but deliberate. The knife slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the counter as she turned to face him. "Henry," she began, her voice shaking. But he silenced her with a look, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. Slowly, cautiously, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her skin. "This shouldn't be happening," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I know," he replied, his tone filled with quiet regret, "but it is." Before she could respond, he leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. Lila melted into him, her hands clutching his shirt as if she were afraid he might disappear. That night marked the beginning of their affair, a secret that bound them together, even as it threatened to tear them apart. They were careful, stealing moments when they were sure no one else would see. A lingering touch in the hallway, a whispered conversation in the garden, a shared glance that spoke volumes. Each encounter left Lila breathless, her heart racing with a mix of exhilaration and fear. But the guilt weighed heavily on her. Every time she looked at Jeremy's photo on the mantel or heard his voice on the phone, she felt the weight of her betrayal. She told herself it was just a phase, a temporary lapse in judgment that would fade with time. But the pull toward Henry was too strong, the connection between them too deep to ignore. Henry, too, struggled with the consequences of their actions. He avoided Jeremy's calls, the sound of his son's voice a painful reminder of the line he had crossed. But when he was with Lila, all his doubts and regrets seemed to fade, replaced by a fierce desire to protect the fragile bond they had created. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the garden, Henry reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. Lila froze, glancing around to make sure they were alone, before allowing herself to relax into his touch. "I don't know how long we can keep this up," she said softly, her voice tinged with fear. "We'll figure it out," Henry replied, his grip tightening. "I'm not letting this go, Lila, not now." His words both comforted and terrified her. She knew he meant them, but the reality of their situation loomed large, a shadow they couldn't escape. Their first real test came a week later when an unexpected visitor arrived. Henry's brother Richard stopped by unannounced, his booming voice filling the house as he greeted them. Lila plastered on a smile, her heart racing as she exchanged pleasantries, all the while hyper-aware of Henry's presence beside her. Richard stayed for dinner, regaling them with stories and jokes that kept the atmosphere light, but beneath the surface, Lila felt the tension simmering. Every time Richard glanced at her, or made an offhand comment about the closeness of their family, she wondered if he could see through her facade. As the evening wore on, Lila excused herself to the kitchen, desperate for a moment alone. She leaned against the counter, her hands gripping the edge as she tried to steady her breathing. "You okay?" Henry's voice startled her, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway. "I'm fine," she lied, though the tremble in her voice betrayed her. He stepped closer, his expression filled with concern. "We'll get through this," he said softly, his hand brushing against hers. Before Lila could respond, Richard's voice called from the living room, breaking the moment. Henry stepped back, his mask of composure slipping back into place as he turned to rejoin his brother. Lila watched him go, her heart heavy with the weight of their secret. She knew their time was running out, and the thought both terrified and exhilarated her. That night, as she lay in bed, Lila stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of Henry. She knew what they were doing was wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. The pull between them was too strong, the connection too deep, and though she feared the consequences, she couldn't imagine a life without him. For now, they were safe, but deep down, Lila knew it was only a matter of time before their fragile world came crashing down. The days stretched into weeks, and Lila's life became a delicate balancing act. Each moment she spent with Henry felt both intoxicating and dangerous, like walking along the edge of a cliff. Every time she heard the phone ring or saw a car pull into the driveway, her heart raced, imagining the worst. Their secret was a fragile thing, teetering on the brink of exposure. Henry, too, seemed increasingly on edge, though his outward demeanor remained calm. There were moments when Lila caught a flicker of worry in his eyes, a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. They both knew the risks they were taking, but neither could bring themselves to stop. It was a Saturday morning when Jeremy called, his voice cheerful on the other end of the line. Lila stood in the kitchen, the phone pressed to her ear as she listened to him talk about his trip. "Things are going well here," he said. "I might actually get to come home a few days early." Lila's stomach dropped. "That's great," she said, forcing a smile she hoped he could hear through the phone. "I thought you'd be happy," Jeremy teased. "You sound distracted. Everything okay?" "Of course," she replied quickly. "Just busy. You know how it is." "Well, I'll let you get back to it. I'll call again tomorrow." As soon as the call ended, Lila sank onto a chair, her hands trembling. She stared at the phone, Jeremy's words echoing in her mind. A few days early. The thought filled her with both relief and dread. She missed him, or at least the idea of him. But his return meant an end to the fragile cocoon she and Henry had built. Henry walked into the kitchen, his expression darkening as he took in her pale face. "What's wrong?" "Jeremy's coming home early," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry's jaw tightened, and he nodded slowly. "I figured it would happen eventually." Lila looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear. "What are we going to do?" He hesitated before stepping closer, his hand brushing hers in a gesture of reassurance. "We'll figure it out, but for now, we have to be careful. More careful than ever." That afternoon, they worked in the garden together, keeping their distance even as their eyes met in fleeting glances. The tension between them was palpable, but they didn't dare speak of it. Lila focused on pulling weeds, her hands moving mechanically as her thoughts raced. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway snapped her out of her trance. She glanced up to see a familiar car pulling in. Jeremy's mother, Margaret, stepping out with a wave. "Surprise!" Margaret called, her voice cheerful as she approached. Lila forced a smile, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Margaret, what a nice surprise." "I thought I'd drop by for a visit," Margaret said, her eyes scanning the garden. "It looks beautiful out here. You and Henry have done a wonderful job." Henry appeared from behind a row of bushes, his expression calm but guarded. "Margaret, good to see you." As they exchanged pleasantries, Lila felt a knot of tension form in her stomach. Margaret's presence was unexpected, and though she was warm and kind as always, her sharp eyes missed nothing. Lila couldn't help but wonder if Margaret noticed the way Henry's gaze lingered on her, or the slight tremor in her hands as she served tea. That evening, the three of them sat in the living room, the fire crackling in the hearth, as Margaret recounted stories about her friends and neighbors. Lila smiled and nodded in all the right places, but her mind was elsewhere, focused on the way Henry avoided looking at her, the way his hand brushed hers when he passed her a cup of tea. Margaret's laughter broke through her thoughts. "You two have been spending a lot of time together, haven't you?" she said, her tone light but curious. "It's nice to see you getting along so well." Lila froze, her heart pounding as she struggled to find a response. Henry, ever composed, nodded with a small smile. "Lila's been a big help around the house. Couldn't have managed the garden without her." Margaret's eyes flicked between them, her expression thoughtful. "That's good to hear. It's important to have someone to lean on, especially when Jeremy's away so much." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Lila forced another smile, her cheeks burning, as she looked down at her lap. She could feel Margaret's gaze lingering on her, searching for something she couldn't name. That night, after Margaret had gone to bed, Lila paced the living room, her thoughts racing. She replayed every word, every glance, every moment from the evening, wondering if Margaret suspected anything. The weight of their secret pressed down on her, suffocating in its intensity. Henry found her there, her arms wrapped around herself as she stared into the dying fire. "You should get some rest," he said softly, his voice filled with concern. "I can't," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Margaret, what if she knows?" "She doesn't," he said firmly, stepping closer. "She's just observant, that's all." "But what if—" "Lila," his voice was steady, grounding her. He reached out, his hand gently gripping her shoulders. "We're careful. We haven't done anything that would give her reason to suspect. You have to trust me." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I'm scared, Henry. I don't know how much longer we can keep this up." His expression softened, and he pulled her into a hug, his arms wrapping around her protectively. "I'm scared too," he admitted, "but I'm not ready to let this go." Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that their time was running out, and the truth would come to light sooner or later. For now, they clung to each other, finding solace in the only place they could. The next morning, Margaret left, her visit brief but unsettling. Lila watched her drive away, her chest tight with a mix of relief and anxiety. She glanced at Henry, who stood beside her, his expression unreadable. "She didn't say anything," Lila murmured. "She didn't have to," Henry replied, but she's gone now, that's what matters." Even as he said it, Lila knew the sense of safety they had felt before was gone. Margaret's presence had been a reminder that their secret wasn't as secure as they thought, and the cracks in their carefully constructed facade were beginning to show. That evening, as Lila sat in the living room, Jeremy called again. His voice was cheerful as always, but Lila felt a pang of guilt with every word he spoke. "I can't wait to see you," he said. "I've missed you." "I've missed you too," she replied, her voice hollow. As they said their goodbyes, Lila felt a lump form in her throat. She stared at the phone, her mind racing. Jeremy's return was imminent, and she didn't know how she would face him, knowing what she had done. Henry found her there, sitting on the couch with her head in her hands. He sat beside her, his presence steady and grounding. "It's gonna be okay," he said softly. "How can you say that?" she asked, her voice filled with anguish. "Jeremy's coming home. Margaret already suspects something. It's only a matter of time before everything falls apart." Henry reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Because we'll face it together. Whatever happens, we'll get through it." Lila looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. She wanted to believe him, to trust that they could weather the storm, but deep down, she knew the truth. Their secret was a ticking time bomb, and the clock was running out. The days before Jeremy's return were a blur of tension and forced normalcy. Lila found herself moving through the house as if on autopilot, her mind racing with thoughts of what his arrival would mean. The stolen moments with Henry had grown fewer and more cautious, the weight of their secret pressing down on both of them. Henry had become quieter, his usual calm demeanor now tinged with a nervous edge. He spent more time in the garden, tending to tasks that didn't need doing, his hands busy but his mind elsewhere. Lila avoided him as much as she could, though not because she wanted to. Every time she saw him, her heart ached, with a mix of longing and guilt that threatened to undo her. Jeremy arrived late in the afternoon on a Thursday, the sound of his car in the driveway sending Lila's pulse racing. She stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she dried a dish, the hum of the engine growing louder with each passing second. When he walked through the door, his smile was warm and genuine, his arms opening wide to greet her. "I'm home," he said, his voice filled with the easy confidence she had once found so comforting. "Ah, welcome back," she replied, forcing a smile as she stepped into his embrace. The scent of his cologne, once familiar and reassuring, now made her stomach churn with unease. Jeremy kissed her cheek, his hands lingering on her waist. "I missed you," he said softly. "I missed you too," she lied, the words catching in her throat. Henry appeared in the hallway, his expression carefully neutral as he extended a hand to his son. "Good to see you, Jeremy." Jeremy shook his father's hand with a firm grip, his smile broad. "You too, Dad. The place looks great as always." "Lila's been a big help," Henry replied, his voice steady. "She's been keeping things running smoothly." Jeremy glanced at her, his eyes filled with affection. "I'm not surprised, she's amazing." Lila's cheeks flushed, and she turned away, the compliment cutting deeper than it should have. The first evening was a minefield of conversations and small talk, the tension between Lila and Henry carefully hidden beneath layers of forced normalcy. Jeremy seemed oblivious, his focus on catching up and sharing stories from his trip, but Lila could feel the cracks in their facade widening with every passing moment. That night, as they lay in bed, Jeremy reached for her, his touch warm and familiar. Lila froze, her body stiffening as guilt surged through her. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "I'm just tired," she replied quickly, her back still turned to him. "It's been a long day." Jeremy hesitated before pulling back, his hand resting on her shoulder. "If there's something on your mind, you can tell me," he said softly. "I'm fine," she insisted, her voice barely above a whisper. But even as she said it, she could feel the weight of her lie pressing down on her, threatening to crush her under its weight. Over the next few days, the tension in the house grew thicker. Jeremy began to notice the strain, his easygoing demeanor giving way to moments of suspicion and frustration. One evening, as they sat in the living room, he turned to Lila, his expression serious. "You've been different lately," he said. "Is everything okay?" Lila's heart raced, her mind scrambling for an explanation. "I've just been stressed," she replied, forcing a smile. "With you being gone so much, it's been a lot to manage." Jeremy frowned, his eyes searching hers. "You know you can talk to me, right? If something's bothering you?" "I know," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "It's nothing, really." But Jeremy wasn't convinced. She could see it in the way his brow furrowed, the way his gaze lingered on her, as if trying to decipher a puzzle. And though he didn't press the issue, the air between them grew colder with each passing day. The breaking point came on a quiet afternoon. Lila had been folding laundry in the bedroom when she heard raised voices downstairs. She froze, the sound of Jeremy and Henry arguing sending a chill down her spine. "I'm just saying, it feels like you've been avoiding me." Jeremy's voice was sharp, his frustration evident. "Every time I try to talk to you, it's like you're somewhere else." "I'm not avoiding you," Henry replied, his tone calm but firm. "I've just been busy." "Too busy to spend time with your own son?" Jeremy shot back, his voice rising. "What's going on with you, Dad? You've been acting weird ever since I got back." Lila crept closer to the top of the stairs, her heart pounding as she strained to hear their conversation. "There's nothing going on," Henry said, his voice steady. "You're reading too much into it." Am I? Jeremy demanded, because it feels like something's changed around here, and no one's telling me what it is. The silence that followed was deafening, and Leela felt her chest tighten as she waited for Henry's response. You're imagining things, Henry said finally, his tone cold. Maybe you should focus on your own issues instead of looking for problems where there aren't any. Jeremy laughed bitterly. Wow, great advice, Dad. Thanks. Lila hurried back to the bedroom, her heart racing as she tried to calm herself. The argument had shaken her, the cracks in their carefully constructed facade now wide enough to see through. And though she didn't know what would happen next, she knew their secret was no longer safe. That evening, as they sat at the dinner table, the tension was palpable. Jeremy's eyes darted between Lila and Henry, his expression a mix of suspicion and hurt. Lila avoided his gaze, her hands trembling as she picked at her food. I feel like I'm missing something, Jeremy said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. What do you mean? Lila asked, her voice shaky. I don't know, he replied, his gaze fixed on her. You tell me. Lila's stomach churned, her mind racing for an answer. I don't know what you're talking about. Jeremy leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. You've been distant ever since I got back, and Dad's been acting weird too. It's like there's some big secret I'm not in on. There's no secret, Henry said calmly, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. Jeremy's gaze shifted to his father, his expression hardening. Then why does it feel like you're both lying to me? The silence that followed was suffocating, and Lila felt the weight of Jeremy's stare bearing down on her. She wanted to tell him the truth, to unburden herself of the guilt that had been consuming her. But she couldn't. Not yet. Jeremy, Henry began, his voice measured, I think you're letting your imagination get the better of you. Maybe, Jeremy replied, his tone cold. Or maybe I'm finally seeing things for what they are. Lila's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding as she realized the truth was closer to the surface than ever before. And though she didn't know how it would all end, she knew they were standing on the edge of something they couldn't come back from.